sesh. Sesh number one.
Yes,
Neurotic Terrain.
Episode uno. That's right. Being human and talking about it.
So, why do we look the way we do?
Well, I'm bad at lying, and I don't want to disturb the therapeutic alliance of myself and numerous clients that I work with as a psychotherapist. So I'm trying to sort of respectfully conceal my appearance so that I can do my thing career-wise, and that I believe in, and work means a lot to me, and also be free to talk with my old friend about life and being a person, and maybe all of it. I need to be able to be a little free and not so stiff. So I'm concealing myself so that I'm a little more safe and loose.
And I'm modifying my appearance just to make it aesthetically compatible. I have another podcast which I've already appeared upon, and I suppose that I could get into trouble for some of the things that I say from time to time, but it's not really a professional consequence, at least as far as I can tell, not yet.
Okay.
That could become an issue down the road, but hopefully not. Maybe there's a change of attitude. We'll see. Supposedly, free speech is on the ascendancy again, and we'll find out if that's the case or not.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, it's been, I'll admit I've had some trepidation about, kind of, I've had fantasies about being attacked by somebody because of what I don't know, or what I might say sort of philosophically about governments and people. And I think,
Well, I think that first, when we're talking about things that we're not expert in, and perhaps even when we're talking about things that we have a lot of familiarity with, I think a good disclaimer is that this is a perspective, and I may be wrong, but I think it's important for us to have conversations about important topics. Yeah. And I guarantee you that, one way or another, whenever you start speaking publicly, someone's going to get upset. So that's just kind of part of the story, and I think the primary thing, and one of the great things about having psychological insight is that you should be able to reach out to those people and try to help them understand why you're saying what you're saying. Or at the very least, try to convey to them the importance of people being able to say what they believe. Because even in the worst case scenario, if someone is saying something truly despicable, well, at least then that that's the person who's thinking along those lines, and that's important too. You really want to know who are the total psychopaths in your society. So free speech is great that way,
Yeah, totally. Well, and or who are the people who are, willingly sort of, stepping into a neutral place of sort of chosen ignorance, which I think probably describes me a little bit. I was sort of thinking of the sort of, but yeah, to speak to what you were just saying, or we could always flee and hide from what is terribly scary in terms of someone getting really angry at you about something that you're out of your depth with. And those are my fears, to be clear. But I think the whole point of Neurotic Terrain is that it will cover various landscapes, and where I have some degree of awareness and knowledge or something is more in the psychological realm and much less in the political realm, right? So NT is sort of has that to offer. In fact, I was thinking a little bit about one of your topics, how to deal with psychological problems in a society that creates psychological problems.
I think, the question as to whether or not there could ever be a society that does not create psychological problems is worth thinking about. There's something about having to aggregate into groups that have some degree of functionality, where the erasure of certain parts of one's individual nature is kind of baked into the pie. And so just, organizations of human beings kind of require that people are funneled into behaviors that they may not have a predisposition towards, and that creates psychological problems.
Mm.
So I think that the one of the virtues of liberalism was the idea that we could have a society where people had freedom of expression and some degree of freedom in their activities to deal with that problem. But there are a host of other problems that come along with that. And I think right now what we're seeing on the world stage is the tension between this kind of trend towards totalitarianism and the effort to hold on to some of the liberal ideals that we think of as being the cornerstone of our civilization, of this project.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was well put. Also makes me sort of, as you're sitting there, there is almost a sort of a regal throne like appearance to your background. I just realized that up on the sides there, it almost looks like pieces of wood. And then there's this all seeing eye behind you,
Yeah,
you're
I'm not
almost
really
like it.
sure what the artifacts are that are creating that framing, but
Yeah, that's
it's
really
kind of
working out.
working.
Yeah, it is working.
I'll say this too, that it kind of, you know, I think that there was a certain, I think that it's easy to forget that the majority of our lives, and this is a very obviously shrinky thing to say, but doesn't make it not so, that the majority of our psychological mental lives, at least more than half, take place under our conscious awareness, right? What was that Jackie Mason quote? Like, oh my unconscious is none of my business, right? It's like it's down there, which means we're operating often from a place where we don't really know entirely what's going on, right? And I think that there's a whole world drama going on down there. There are various plays going on down there throughout our lives, and especially as we're children and we're being sort of formed, we just have a lot of feelings, and a lot of them aren't conscious and a lot of them are unpleasant. And I think that has probably always been the case. I think that's how we're built. But let's just say, being really overly generalistic, back in the day, there simply wasn't enough time, and good old the old Maslow's pyramid thing was just demanding so much of us in terms of everyday nuts and bolts: stay warm, don't get eaten by a larger creature, make fire, or further on down the line, farm, work, or you starve, so that just took precedence. But I think that maybe it has less to do with the messed up things that modern life is causing in us, and more to do with, and this is an obvious point, but more to do with the relative luxury of going higher up on the pyramid, so that more of our inner neuroses can come out. They're just going to come out. They're just going to be the next thing in line to deal with. Once you're warm, once you're fed.
Well, the higher up you go on the pyramid, the further away you are from Earth. So
Good
the
point. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the solidity, the foundation is the thing closest to the bottom, and that's where
Mm-hmm.
the root is. The root is the thing which allows the thing to grow, right? You have to have a solid root in order for things to be able to rise up, let's say. And yeah, I just have been working on a analysis of the pyramid as a metaphor for the way power functions. And I think that one of the things that tends to happen is that the further up in the pyramid you go, the less connected to the root you really are, and the tighter the space is too. So there's, I think, more of a sense of being enclosed, isolated somehow or another, uh, in a capsule, you know. And And so that sense of disconnection, I think, is kind of part of what happens. I mean, you think about what happens when people get high up in hierarchies. Typically, they become afraid of the population because the population is quite often very dissatisfied with them. And so they will have
Mm.
security and they will be basically
Mhm.
unable to just freely mingle with the rest of the population. So they are very profoundly isolated in a certain way. It's only the people who have been vetted that they're willing to mingle with. And
Right. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
and sometimes that turns into extreme paranoia if there are some very powerful people who are interested in taking some other very powerful people out. you
Yeah.
know, uh, you might have to have a taster for all of your meals and that sort of a
Yeah.
thing, you
Yeah.
know?
Exactly. Yeah.
So all this stuff
What a
is real,
strange.
although it's not part of our everyday experience. I think it is in some ways part of our everyday awareness because I think that people are increasingly, when a society starts to get uncomfortable, it thinks more and more about its leadership.
Well, yeah. I think when a band gets more and more uncomfortable, same thing, right?
Yeah,
You know, thinks
absolutely.
more.
So yeah, uh, who else would you blame but the leader? I mean, that's basically the job. If you take the job of leadership, you're essentially shouldering the responsibility for what happens to the group.
Yeah.
And if things go bad, that's really what people should do. They should turn and point to their leaders and be like, "Hey, I thought you knew what you were doing."
But pulling back the camera a little bit, man, and I think now that we're talking, I'm getting used to the way you speak again. It also occurs to me while we're talking, and this will be sort of, perhaps one of my roles is kind of, um, you're just so, you are very smart and your brain is very strong and you will describe things in a way that sometimes makes you hear the words and the shapes of the words and what you're describing. Um, and you know that there is a very large technical delivery behind that. And I don't mean to imply that what you're saying is opaque or just sort of too, highfalutin to get, but it's definitely like there's almost like a, you know, and I think like this is interesting because this has to do some with the underpinnings of the history of our relationship where I'm younger than you. We have had various endeavors together over the years, and you've always been in a position of relative just not really hierarchy because you certainly don't wield it like that, but of greater experience, greater wisdom, and greater sort of your role is more technically strong, right? And so, kind of one of the without being sort of a buffoon or a prankster, one of the things I can kind of do is perhaps bring this to a place that is a little more meat and potatoes and accessible without dumbing it down, man. You know what I mean?
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm
Yeah, I mean,
saying?
absolutely. And, one way of looking at it is that whatever it is that you steep yourself in, it's a long process. So in order to get that tea really like to the point where it's going to have the full satisfaction of the drink, you got to let it sit there. And there's a lot of things that happen in that process that you can't describe when you're just speaking what your understanding of things is. So as in
Totally.
your position as someone who's gotten very deep into the psychology and the history of the psychology, all of the various texts and the different figures who have played a big role in psychology. When you're
The
starting to talk
cats.
about
Yeah.
it, you're choosing a few sentences to represent something that's been years of study. So
Ginormous. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and it's really hard to like flush out to choose words that are going to give one the sense of all of the intricacies, all of the details, all the depth. So it's very difficult, I think, to find a way of speaking that is able to convey complex problems, and that's why typically people don't speak that way.
Yeah,
And
totally,
it's
man.
easy for
Yeah,
people to
yeah.
just sort of like zone out once you start referring to things that are maybe a little bit outside of their comfort zone. And particularly if the problem is that if you're going to try to address it by going in the technical direction where you're going to explain every little bit of it, then that just makes people completely zone out. So that dry technical approach to difficult problems, I think, is really problematic. But on the other hand, when you start speaking poetically, people go, "What the hell is this guy talking about?"
What
Like,
the Fletch are you saying? Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Oh,
So it's a bit of a dilemma, you know?
yep, yep. I think also it's the subtext, and this is obvious, right? Everything to me is a nail. But let's also be fair to old. I almost said my name to old NT here. And that is my name today. All right. But let's be fair here and say that I was going to say part of the reason why I think about those things. I think that what I'm trying to say is that it is true for myself, and I think it is true for all of us that there is our feelings are playing a very large role in how we verbally, technically, performance wise, behaviorally operate at any given moment, right? So it's like, even in our talking right now, what has happened so far, this is our first show. The caffeine is hit. I haven't had enough food. Had a bit of a situation earlier that was kind of a pain in the ass and kind of knocked me down several pegs. It's been sort of a peg knocking down couple of weeks. I've been,
Yeah.
so I've been kind of sick and doing some side hustle work in the music commercial realm, which, as you know, is not known for its honesty and goodness.
Yeah.
Let us say with a nasty smile. But just saying that as we're sitting here, immediately what starts to happen is I'm like, wait a minute, it's like, wow. I'm not used to talking to somebody who is not one of my patients. A, B, wow, I forgot, am I getting in over my head, right? But it's now I'm sort of saying that, but metaphorically, this is true of all these all interactions, right? There is this subtext going on behind the scenes that is driving us, right? And it's kind of like you could watch any human action or thing on a camera, and even complex political interactions, and there is a very simple, almost Lego like form to it emotionally. What is driving this person to do this? What is driving this person to do that? You
Yeah,
know,
and that integrates perfectly with what we were talking about before, because quite often the thing that's happening on the surface is tailored specifically to try to reach the attention and the comprehension of as many people as possible. And so that's why it kind of has that Lego block kind of feel to it. But then behind that, you have all the subtext and all the, internal machinations and the positions that are kind of being held, but also hidden. And then there are emotional dimensions to it as well. I think that the extent to which that is something which is 100% necessarily baked into human experience is maybe a debatable issue. I think that some of the spiritual traditions emphasize a way of freeing ourselves from the, let's say, power of those emotional influences. Now,
mm,
the extent to which that's actually possible, I think, is also questionable. But I think it's possible to some extent. I mean, in some ways, isn't that
totally,
part of the psychological development that, all of the immediate sense gratification reactions that we have as a baby are essentially sublimated so that we can, act
totally,
civilized or however you want to frame
yeah,
it,
sure,
mature, basically, so that we're
sure.
not as influenced by our emotions. Although, under certain circumstances, we're going to be pressed and we're going to get plunged back into them. And the degree to which the pressure of that circumstance is in
Yeah.
intensity is the extent to which that emotion is going to be more difficult to manage.
That's a really smart thing. That's great. I'm glad. Thank you for saying that. Man, it's like too, you can kind of like the idea of therapy is that it's okay that there's a problem. In a lot of ways, the idea behind some Buddhist practices is the same thing, right? It's okay. It's shitty to be human. It's okay. There's a problem. It doesn't have to be fixed. It doesn't have to be clung to. It doesn't have to overwhelm or describe, right? There can be some distance. And it also makes me think too of how sometimes if you take music, for instance, making music often, right? You think of it as such an emotional thing. But in a lot of ways, when you're actually making or composing a piece of music, right? If you're not distracted and if nothing's bothering you per se at that moment, right? You're not sick, you're not hungover, you're not brokenhearted, nothing's really that wrong, at least in that moment. You're just making it for it and you're doing it, right? But as soon as it needs to be delivered somewhere, now you're back in the realm of potential shame, potential inflation of that part of your psyche that is a sort of organ of narcissism, right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? It just gets out of whack a lot, right? Which is a big part of maybe what's happening on the world stage right now. P.S.
Well,
Right? So,
that's the power of the observer, right? As
yes.
soon as something is being observed, it changes its behavior. And the idea of being free is essentially this fantasy that somehow or another no one's going to notice what we're doing.
Yeah.
But that's not the case, and of course, the ultimate observer would be God, which is essentially within you, observing everything that you do. And we all know precisely what it is that we've done. I mean, I guess maybe there are some rare cases where there's some kind of damage where you've just completely forgotten everything you've done. I don't know. That seems possible. But in general, consciousness is something that is maintained through life. We kind of all know the things that we've done that we wouldn't want other people to know about, that we wouldn't want seen, but it's still seen. It's still seen within us. And that's something we all have to
Totally.
wrestle with.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and I think that part of the really interesting thing about doing a podcast or, making public statements in general, kind of getting out there into the public square, is that it does toughen you in terms of your the hesitation that one has in order to go through that process of expressing yourself. If you're writing the song, for example, like
Mm-hmm.
someone who never confronts the audience in writing all the songs, in a way, you're not really writing songs. you know
Okay. I want to interject there. I want you to finish that thought, but then, yeah, finish that thought. I got
Yeah,
something
so
very.
part of basically life is interaction. And
Mhm.
so the interaction is something which informs you what's happening with your expression. Because in your expression, you're always making mistakes. There's always something that could be a little bit better. Maybe there's a big mistake that you make in an expression, right? And then the message you get
Mm,
back from the world is the way that you learn how to
Mhm.
get better at it. It's
Modify
like
it.
any
Yeah,
other kind of skill.
totally, man.
And
It's true.
so then it really starts to help you get into alignment with your ability to express.
It really hurts, though. You
Oh
know,
yeah, man, it's
it really
brutal.
hurts.
It's
It really
brutal.
hurts, man. It really hurts. I often fantasize about being in prison, and I think I do that mostly because of latent homosexual. No, I'm just kidding. I often fantasize about being in prison because it makes me think of, okay, so much of my life takes place in my own head that sometimes I just kind of want it to stay that way, right? um because the honeymoon, really, it just blows when the honeymoon's over.
Okay.
I mean, you know how it is when you're a musician. You write something, and in order to get it done, you've got to get really turned on. You get really turned on, and then it makes an opinion about the thing, right? And then you present it, and as you're presenting it, the horror of its flaws gets revealed, and it is a very jagged and painful experience. Now, going back to the prison thing, it makes me think of, like, at times I fantasize about, like, wow, if I were there, right? Never mind the other underpinnings of why does he do that, but just saying, in this case, like, could I help myself survive the terrible experience of being in prison by writing things in my head? I would have let's just say, in this scenario, I have no device. I'm not given extra privileges of no guitar, no, you know, I'm not carving chess pieces out of stolen rocks from the yard. I can't do anything, right? I just have my head, right? But I can make figures and phrases musically in my head, and I can sing them. And I can even, like, over the years, being a weirdo, I can accompany them. So I can start to multi-track in my head, you know? And if it just stays in there and I make, like, let's say I make an album, I make like maybe many albums, right? Maybe I'm going years. What if I'm just the only audience member? What is that? Is that just masturbatory? Is that one hand clapping? What the hell is that?
Well, you don't know, and you never will know, because there are some people who create in absolute obscurity and then later are discovered one way or
Right.
another. So you really never know the actual consequences of pretty much anything you do. It may like you'll get an immediate sense of some of the consequences, good or bad, but then like ultimately all down the road, like some of the bad things may turn out to have been good and some of the good things may turn out to be bad. So you just really don't know ultimately. But apparently, um, what you described is actually what Shostakovich did. Shostakovich wrote these string quartets, I think, if I remember correctly, when he was essentially imprisoned in a concentration camp, I believe, maybe.
Yeah, wasn't it Messiaen who wrote the Quartet for the End of Time? Its first performance took place, I think, in a concentration camp. I
That
might
rings a
be
bell too, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, clearly the creative process has that dimension to it because even if you are writing for an audience, more often than not, it's not really going to be much of an audience. All right? I mean, most of the creative output of anyone who's interested in doing that kind of thing is pretty
That's
much
so true.
ignored, right? And
It's so true.
irrelevant. So
It's gonna die.
ultimately,
Yeah,
we're doing it
yeah.
for ourselves. It's a kind of catharsis, I think.
Yes,
And
yes,
and
yes.
that's really, I think, the bottom line. And that's why it doesn't matter what they what they say or think. I mean, it
Yeah,
will
right.
it will influence things, but it doesn't matter in an existential way, and it doesn't really
Yeah, yeah,
reflect
yeah,
on the
yeah,
value of the
yeah.
work either.
Right.
Because
It's true.
the value of the work is the catharsis.
And it's also kind of befriending yourself, right? You're
Yeah, I
sort
think
you're like
so. And getting comfortable with the facts of who you are.
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I've gone through an experience in the past year or two where there has been a degree of loss in terms of access to people and groups of people, and I have survived by making music in headphones that mostly I only hear. And some of it, now that I've had that jagged experience of showing it to others, I realize it's going to stay that way. Um, because, because it ain't so hot. You know what I mean? But that's okay because those things really got me through, baby. They got
Yeah.
me through. And because I believed they were great, that helped me, this does go back to a sort of more broad thing, of a sort of harebrained theory of mine called the swiveler, which will be really kind of hard to describe, but it's the idea that
Can I make just one point before we talk about the Swiveler? Which
please.
is that some of the greatest things have flaws in them that are so serious that the creator dismissed it out of hand as being worthless because they were so painfully aware of those flaws. But the other
Oh God.
aspect of it is something that took on a richness that was, the inspiration for having done it. But, in the realization of it, someone gets embarrassed because there's things that, in music, for instance, don't sound the way you want things to sound, you know?
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think that
Yes.
quite often the most profound art is something that has an incredibly deep flaw to it. And that's really part of the value of a real expression, because a real expression
Mhm.
has to be flawed because that's part
So
of
true.
reality.
Yes, it is. It is. It is. Yes. Yes. I was just going to say something crass. Uh, Even the most attractive person, if you really have a look at them naked, there's going to be something vaguely yucky or disappointing.
Oh, I
Yeah.
think sometimes the most beautiful people are really the ugliest.
Oh God. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Lizards.
you take a look at any of these like model types or the movie stars, and
Hmm.
there is just something absolutely hideous about them on an
Although
on an
there's something to
essential
be said.
level.
Oh, complete. Well, but and there's something to be said too for the a client of mine once. I hope it's okay for me to quote her out there. She made up a term, muela. She made up the word herself, muela, and what it means is sort of the intoxication and spell of glamour. Right?
Mm.
It's we we cook it up ourselves and project it onto the person. Ideally, they are a projection screen that vaguely matches what we want and what we think makes the whole encounter, sexual or otherwise, just delicious, you know.
I think this is one of the most damaging aspects of the way our culture operates. And it really, I think, gets in the way of people's ability to have a full life.
Oh man.
The
Yeah.
images and the,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, the worlds that, imaginary worlds that arise as a result of these images are just so punishing in, uh, in contrast to reality.
Yeah.
I think people get absolutely disabled by that stuff, and it really is,
It's true.
you know, the sad thing about it too is that quite often it's the prime source of enjoyment is the revelry in these images.
It's the creation of a sort of story that also it's not just the images, it's what they cook up in ourselves and our story about ourselves in that moment, whether that be in the throes of masturbating or which that I
Right.
just I
Yeah.
loathe that word, but it does cook up a kind of it is very intoxicating. I
Yeah.
myself am like a not even in not so much in anything like uh, anyway, I don't want to get too personal, but I myself am a major victim of getting high on a narrative about myself and someone else, or just myself, or my role with myself and other people. I get high on the narrative. I enjoy a sort of tempered grandiosity for a period of time, and then I fall to, basically what feels like icicles heading upward, and I just fall into just a very sharp cold experience of like, hey, that wasn't entirely true, buddy. And it
Yeah.
sucks.
I think we believe any of these narratives at our own peril. And it's incredibly difficult to not construct a narrative about ourselves with relation to what's going on. Because what the mind does all the time is say, "Am I okay?" You know,
Yeah.
you're in a circumstance. There are things that you have to deal with. You're ultimately going to experience pleasure or pain or some kind of neutrality as a result of whatever your actions are, or whatever the actions are of the forces around you. And so you're constantly thinking about, am I doing okay? Am I negotiating the situation well? And when you start to get messages that suggest you're not, that dialogue becomes even more important. So it's incredibly difficult to resist. And I think in some respects, the this is very similar to the issue of expressing yourself, because ultimately we will end up failing in our endeavor to successfully survive. It's just a matter of time,
A
right?
positive sentiment here on
I
Tuesday.
mean, on some level, why would we want to avoid the most elemental reality regarding life? I think that this is one of the things that some traditional cultures have had a far more healthy relationship with. So, for example, the celebration of the dead,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And like in New Orleans, they'll have the joyous music playing at the after the burial, right? So
Mm,
I think they
mm.
play the mourning music on the way to the gravesite, and then after that they burst into joyous. It's developing a relationship with the inevitable. Seems
Yeah,
like a pretty foundational kind of
it's true.
approach to life.
Yeah.
So yeah, part of that narrative is to try to protect us from that
Yeah.
inevitability. So we're
Yeah, yeah.
basically constantly going, oh, I screwed up. That means I'm just a little closer to death, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, totally. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it's that death instinct
Yeah,
too,
it's profound, you know?
Yeah, totally,
Like I
totally.
lost some money doing a stupid thing a little while ago, and
Mm,
it was painful, you know? Um, and it's not the first time it's happened in my life.
mm,
So that additional kind of layer of, man, you really fucked that up,
mm.
uh,
Yeah, yeah.
is really painful to have to, like, what is the narrative I'm going to tell about myself now?
That
Right?
I did that. Yeah,
Ah,
it's
it's
the
brutal.
secondary burn. I used to call it that. I know I'm technically wrong about this, but it looked like in my wood burning stove back in this place I used to have that the logs were burning and that the fire was burning down there, but that the smoke was lighting itself on fire above it. So I always thought of that as there were sort of two fires going on, and I have vaguely heard from firefighters that smoke kind of burns a little
Yeah, no,
bit.
that's actually what is doing the burning. It's the gases. So
It's
quite
the right.
often,
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
have a
yeah, yeah.
smoking fire, if you light the smoke, the whole thing will light up.
No shit. So
Yeah.
but this is still a shoddy metaphor, but I'll eat my shoes if it's wrong in terms of people. Is you know I what keeps me in business and what makes humans neurotic is a crappy feeling about a crappy feeling, right? It's a
Right.
secondary burn, right?
Yeah.
It's like take illness, right? It's bad enough to have an illness, right? I feel terrible right now, but it's the meaning and the extreme, and again, these stories like, oh God, and shame, all kinds of so many different little intruders and torturers will come along
Well, that's why
to
it's like a
accompany you.
spiral, you know?
Oh, it's just the worst.
So,
Yeah. And
that
it's
that whole Fibonacci thing where, the shell as it's continuing its descent, if you like, at each phase, like there's something that's built upon the previous one that's making the case against you in your own mind.
oh, it's just the worst, but it also works great in the other direction. And honestly,
Well, sometimes I
you know,
wonder if the other direction is what produces this, like, it's because we feel the need to build ourselves up that we end up tearing ourselves down.
it's true. I am honestly still pretty. I think that I say it's true, and I think I agree with you technically. I really don't know what I'm talking about because I myself, I think this is true of other people with big mood disorders, and that is that I like the feeling of being intoxicated emotionally enough so that I'm willing to pay the fee. And I sort of know that as I pull myself towards +5, then I'm going to bypass zero or what could be described as a sort of emotional neutrality that is not trapped in that horrible samsara attachment hell, that, I know I'm going to go right past, I'm going to take the express train from +7 right past zero to -7,
Yeah.
but I like +7 enough and I've had enough -7s, even -20s. So I'm like, you know what? Fuck him, right? I like this right now, and I sort of remember +7. I have a dim awareness that the truth of -7 isn't all there. It's not totally accurate. And I sort of know that +7 might show up again. The sun's going to shine again, And the same is
Yeah.
true with +7. I am aware this won't last. And I will even get sort of oddly paranoid about ways to continue it, right? How can I not have this end,
Well, there is
So,
something about the negative side of the scale that is the place where you develop the strength to resurrect yourself,
yeah, totally.
you know?
Yes.
So that I think is
Completely.
a really valuable lesson, right? The Taoists do say, however, that the bigger the up and down kind of oscillation,
Hmm.
the shorter the lifespan.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, given that death is an inevitability, does it matter, the length? Like, is that really the most important measure? Like how long does that string go? I mean, kind of knowing the ups and downs really gives you a greater depth of experience in life. And so
Mm, yeah.
there's a value in that as well. Long
Isn't
life
that
is not
interesting?
I mean, long life is, I think, in some ways one of the biggest problems that we have right now.
Right. As a
It's just this idea
species.
of survive at any cost. And that I think has a cost.
Well, it's also like really hard to leave. It's oh, it's just so freaking terrifying, you know? If we had a better idea of of what it's like once you die, and it wasn't a bad thing, we might be a little more willing.
Well, we do
But
have
if
that. There are a lot of near-death experience testimonies, many of which, almost all of them, I think, correspond with each other. I've read a little bit about it, but I'm not like super into it, so I haven't read extensively about it. But it seems like in general, people do go to quite a great place. They have this kind of the white light, they're moving towards the white light. They see themselves from outside their bodies, so they're kind of viewing remotely their own, you know,
Mm.
corpse. And these are people obviously who died and then came back, by the
Yeah,
way.
these are the ones who survive. How do you know
Yeah.
what's beyond that way? What if that's just a freaking doorway and it stinks over on that other side? I mean, the other thing is true. That does describe the difference between us a little bit. And that is that for me, as soon as you say that, the first isn't this interesting? The first vibes that went along with that description, of course, I've heard it before too, was uh, it sounds not very warm. Like my favorite type of light is sort of orange kind of tavern light, right? Sort of orange tavern library type of light, right? Those little
Yeah.
green lamps that shine down on a
Yeah.
wooden table kind of deal. And white light sounds kind of cold, right? And it sounds sort of empty. There's not much of a bin of coziness and people and turkey pot pie. And I'm just like, this kind of, I don't know, I miss my mommy. That's like,
I'm
you know.
I can relate to that a lot because right now I'm trying to figure out the white light problem because I do believe that a lot of these LED lights that are so energy efficient are really bad for your eyes.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to figure out a way to balance the
Oh yeah.
use of that stuff, and it really is.
Oh yeah.
It's challenging.
I
It's a
hoard old.
harsh feeling. Once you're aware of it, it's like your eyes really are just getting pierced.
Oh, it's disgusting. I remember when they started switching over the headlights of cars
Oh
to
yeah,
LED light, and I was like, "This is vaguely criminal. I'm
yeah.
going to crash. Like, are you out of your fucking mind? You don't even have your brights on, and I'm going to crash." Also, I have at my office three old school light bulbs that I am coveting and have not used yet. They're saved for treats. And you can, if you go online, you can still find some, ones. And but at the old hardware store, there's no such thing anymore. They're all that nasty artificial light.
Yep.
I
Sometimes you can find halogens, but they are short-lived, I found. They just blow out fast. It's an okay light. It's pretty good, but it
I was
gets
just thinking I wanted to not leave this stone unturned really quick. Sorry to speak over you.
no good.
That
It's all good.
um because we got like 10 more minutes here
Okay.
for our first hour long program. We started about 1:10, and that gives me a whopping 20-minute lunch. Um which is actually pretty damn luxurious in my world, but it has to be accompanied by several other reality based items. Anyway, but it's so nice to float around with you in this zone. It really has. This is very nice. But just to say that sense of am I okay, and sort of every, you know, am I safe from death? So very true, and I think also for so many of us, at least sadly, maybe mostly those of us in the first world, it's am I cool? Am I great? Am I beautiful? Am I special? Is there a glow to me that makes me valuable? And that is so inextricably connected to a sense of safety for so many of us, right?
Hmm.
Like,
I think a
and a
lot of that
sense of
has to do with the images that we grew up with. You
Oh
know,
God, yes. And
yeah.
sexual function, literally, if for so many of us, if you feel good about yourself in one realm, it's really wonderfully easy to transfer it over to the sexual realm, right? I just brought meat to the cave, and other Neanderthals bowed to me as I walked by, and one of them even handed me his club and was like, "Here, you take this. You use this better than I do. You're a real badass." And then I go to the cave, and I've brought delicious meats. I have made fire. I am better than other apes. And let's get into the sack and celebrate. Look at what I can produce down here in my loins. It's just
Well,
so
that's one
obvious.
strategy, but then there's also kind of the peacock strategy, which is just basically like, look at my fabulousness,
Yes.
which is I think kind of what a lot of celebrity is about. It's
Mhm.
basically this just look at this specimen. Don't you want to reproduce with this specimen?
Yeah, yeah,
You know?
totally. Right. What I want to know is how can you feel hyper vulnerable, utterly wimpy, ineffective, forgotten, uh, 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 criticized, and found out for being violently flawed? And how does that become, how does that produce a great sexual performance? How can you go from a place of utter vulnerability and being disarmed and feeling like a complete loser in reality and suddenly perform top notch in bed, right?
You stop thinking
Like,
about yourself.
right there you go.
'Cause, like even the most fantastic peacock will one day become a damaged, kind of decrepit bird, you know? And
That's a wonderful image, isn't it, though?
yeah, I mean, it's just
Bones
absolutely
showing,
true.
feathers fading.
So
Yeah,
you got to have some other aspect of your game other than just strutting around,
that's right.
and
That's right. And by the way,
when it comes to the
yeah,
other strategy, of like proving yourself, which is like the caveman bringing home the bacon and yeah, proving your worth. That also has a limited shelf life because at a certain point you can't take down those woolly mammoth anymore. They're
yeah, exactly.
it's outside
Right.
of your physical capacity. So I think that stages of life, obviously some people are gifted with certain things more than others. And so there are a lot of people who never get to be a peacock, right? But
Hmm.
being a peacock is kind of a drag.
It's a bit of a bummer, isn't it?
It's
Yeah.
all this like attention and all this like hubbub,
Yeah.
and then you're dealing with these backstabbing, it's like basically you never trust anyone around you ever.
Right. Well, and then we're going back to the leaders. We're
Yeah.
sort of circling back to the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Because we're not just talking about a peacock that's strutting their stuff and that is beautiful. We're talking about people who are respected in what feels like in reality very legitimate ways. Here is a leader. Here is an
It's
orator. Here is
any
somebody,
any
right?
position at the top of any pyramid,
Right.
you know?
Right. Like even a great speaker who is absolutely benevolent in every way, and any of, fill in the blank with anybody who sits up in front of an audience and everybody knows that this cat knows how to meditate and he is wise and or she and knows or whatever pronoun they prefer and is just in the spiritual psycho-spiritual realm has something very profound and will offer relief, and this person is how do they avoid the intoxication that comes along with being important to so many
They
people?
usually don't.
How do they
I
avoid
mean,
it?
look at what
How do they
happens with
avoid it?
all of those charismatic cult leaders. You know
Oh
what
my
one of the
God.
really interesting things is, like one of the examples that's quite often used of a cult leader is Jim Jones, and he's just thought of as being this like insane evil man.
Monstrous.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just saw a program about him the other day. I was reacquainted with the weirdness of all that. Yes,
Well,
continue.
if you look into his early works, he would be difficult to differentiate from a saint. He was initially someone who was petitioning essentially and working really hard to support the racial integration process,
Mm,
and was doing tangible works to try to help people who are in disadvantaged positions. And it just
mm,
spiraled out of control. There's an incredible series about that, that's on the Martyr Made podcast, Daryl Cooper,
Mm.
who's a controversial character, but I think he's a very good researcher and is really good at doing long form discussions. Discussion is not the
Mhm.
right word. Monologues, long form monologues about historical topics. And that series that he does on Jim Jones, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's incredible.
Oh, wow.
It
Yeah,
goes through
that
the
sounds
whole
very
process, and
interesting.
it took many, many years for things to get to the level of insanity they ended up in.
It's people aren't simple.
No,
We're just not. None of this is simple. It makes you think about, you know, it's like really, it will bake your noodle, and this could be the caffeine talking, but you kind of have to stick. It's like we've actually sort of freely been roving sort of naturally from subject to subject, but if you start to try to get a feeling for the totality of the human experience and how the sameness of us all and yet the complexity of us all,
I think
it's a
that's a perfect way of putting it, and I do think that that does describe the overall
man.
landscape of the neurotic terrain.
Oh my God, it makes my brain a little bit want to explode, but I think protein is going to help with that. I really do. I really do.
There's
This
one
has
thing that I
been,
want to remember to discuss maybe in a future episode, which is the countervailing argument to uh, what it means to express, the kind of strengthening aspect of expressing, because there's another strengthening aspect of not expressing, of like
hmm
keeping it within yourself and kind
hmm
of being good with that. There's this famous, I think it might be
mm,
a Taoist phrase that says, those that say don't know, and those that know don't say. So,
yeah. Oh yeah.
let's not
Oh,
presume that necessarily. I
oh,
mean, the thing,
I'll tell you.
another aspect of our culture is that we do have this urge to express ourselves, which is also something that comes as a consequence of these narratives that we've gotten very involved in, the celebrity
Totally.
stories, if you like.
Oh God, yeah, yeah. Are you
So
kidding me? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, and again, you're kind of confronted with the thing that's kind of baked into you and the questioning as to, is this good? Is this, we're back to that, like, are we doing something stupid here? Is this a
Yeah.
worthwhile endeavor?
Yeah. Yep. Well,
I've been
and
struggling that since I started talking as a child.
yeah, and well, and I think I have always, well, let's that what that we have to round off in a sec, but
Yep.
that brings up an excellent question just for therapists, right? Like in which is a very small topic relatively to what sort of the bigness of what, kind of mind cracking bigness of what we were just talking about.
Well, we
But
got to bring it
the
home, right? So yeah.
the well, the idea being like, man, how do you sit there and not and resist the desire to help? Right? I call it the fixing energy. Succumbing to the fix it energy, even when it's at its most pure. And a lot of times it's not. A lot of times the fix it energy is sort of veiled wanting to strut your stuff in terms of what you have learned, what you have spent 100 grand supposedly learning.
Right.
And you want to say, look at these toolbox. You've come here. I am a mechanic. Your car's making a bad clanking sound. I know right where that is. I will fix it. Open the hood. Allow me to fix it. Right. Which, goes to another whole subject where, of course, the psychotherapeutic relationship couldn't be more not direct than that, right? That hood doesn't want to open. Most of the real problems don't want to get found. They like it down there. But,
Right.
but the
Yeah.
bottom line is you want to stretch your stuff. You want, or at the very least, sometimes you are simply forced to watch somebody suffer endlessly, right? Over and over again. And you want so badly to make them feel better. You feel surges of empathy that are at times very much unmanageable.
Uh,
And and you want to fix and you want to help, you want to hold out. But it's not, you don't have to do anything. You just have to know things, but don't say them. You have to be there, but don't act. It's very hard, you know?
you know what this makes me think of? It's kind of interesting. I've noticed recently that I'm playing with a number of different bands, and sometimes I get to hear the band. I mean, this is going to sound a little arrogant, but I'm just going to say it because I think it's really interesting. Like I just played a gig where I had a gig beforehand, and I only
Mm-hmm,
made it to the second set.
mm-hmm,
And what I heard from people after the show is that the band is much better when I'm playing with them, you know?
Sure. Yeah.
And I kind of know this is true, but I couldn't really figure out why,
Hmm.
and I think that really what it is, like I could be doing almost nothing. Remember when we played, I don't know if this is giving too much away. Remember,
I don't think so. We're fine.
yeah, so we remember when we were playing with Clip.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Wait a minute.
sometimes Clip would just be on stage with like fucking wood block or something, like a cowbell, you know? And he'd be
Uh,
making the whole thing happen.
Yeah.
He would do so little and so much would be happening. He'd bring it together. It's like he was containing the knowledge in his body and
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
radiating out from him and that like his musical energy organized everything around him, even though he was doing almost nothing. And I feel like that's kind of what I'm doing in some of these bands now, where I don't really have to do much. I'm just kind of like getting everyone to feel,
Yes.
you know
Yes.
what I mean? And
Yes.
that's the same thing I
Yes.
think you're describing, really. It's
That's
like you've
fascinating. Yeah.
gotten something inside of you to the point
Yes.
where you're just sort of living it.
It's so true.
And
That's such a great, fascinating way to say it, man. We got to stop it, man. I got to add this. Like, that's why it's so good to not be a front man sometimes and such a pain in the ass to be a front man because you've got this responsibility of making the main delivery, like you've got to boogie in a way and you got to say some words and people are going to, hold that mic. But when it's so interesting that audience members are often drawn to you when you aren't in 100% uh, towing the party line of what's happening musically, but you are very much participating and open to it. You're just sort of existing within it, and people are oddly attracted to that in the audience because it's fucking interesting. It's a little bit different. Even if it's the best music ever, the full conscious delivery of the product is in and of itself a little boring. And people
oh,
want to see somebody doing something other.
I agree
What's
with
that
you.
guy up
Man,
to?
I agree
Right?
with you so much on that. And I feel like you and I have always shared that. Like
Yeah.
you and I are never idiomatically correct, you know?
Yeah. Oh, it's so true. I'm so glad you said that. I'm never in the right place. I'm too weird to be hip, and I'm definitely not too hip to be weird, but I'm too square to be weird. I'm always stuck.
Well, it's the liminal space, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
the edges, it's the boundary conditions that are very interesting. That's where all the action is really happening, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, quite often the best players, quote unquote, are the most boring,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And again, we're back to that flaw. It's like
Yeah.
the real artistic space is where there's something that ain't quite right.
Yeah.
Because
Right.
if it's all completely conforming with what expectation is,
Yeah.
then you've heard it a million times.
Totally.
And
Totally.
who needs
I know at the
that?
same Yeah, at the same time, I'm a sucker. I get a nice little soundtrack going, and my chest starts to inflate, and I feel like emotional and really happy and vaguely patriotic about what I'm not entirely sure. And I just really wanna have a good time with that sound, And I'm buying it. All right, we got to stop, man.
Okay,
That was really nice. That was
beautiful.
really nice.
I
Yeah,
think
good.
that yeah, we hit it out of the park on the what do you call it? The maiden
The maiden
voyage, man.
voyage.
Yeah, the maiden
Yes.
voyage.
There
Little
you
Herbie
are,
Hancock.
Herbie Hancock.
Yeah.
Dun, dun.